Welcome to the show for sinners and sufferers. My name is Cody.
And I'm Trev.
And this is our third part, talking about table, pulpit, square, the life of the church. If you're just jumping in on this one, you might be a little bit lost. It'll probably still be good conversation, but if you're like, what on earth? Go back to part one where we talk about what the church is, as in who the church is, I guess would be a better way of phrasing it. And then how we live as the church in these three different realms, the table being the inward focus, the pulpit being the upward focus as in our worship services. And now we're going to talk about the square, the outward focus, which is, I almost say this is where the Great Commission comes to life, but that would have been a misspeak because really we lived out the Great Commission in all these realms.
Yeah.
We're making disciples in all these areas, but
you should be making disciples throughout all of this, and you can't make disciples without all of this.
Yes. So. This is the salt and light aspect. Yes. I'll say that. Yes. There we go. This is where we follow in Jesus' footsteps of stepping into the world to bring the good news to needy people, to demonstrate righteousness, and preach life to the perishing. Can you tell I was reading that from my notes?
I can tell.
It was really good.
That is very good.
If I'm not reading from my notes, it's never good.
It's nice and clean.
But yeah, this is, speaking of notes, this is the one I have the least on because you said this is your jam.
This is my jam. No, it's not my jam, but because we planted a church, I had to spend a lot of time thinking about that aspect of it. And I do think that's what I love about church planting is that by the nature of it, you're always thinking, if we don't reach out to people, this thing's over. Mm-hmm. So church planting just kind of keeps you very aware of that. It's a lot like starting a small business. You don't have to tell somebody who starts a small business, you should probably keep at it.
Yeah.
It's like you don't have a choice. It just forces you to really dig into, because if you don't, you just won't exist. You can't afford to just do this. So I think that's what I would say is my jam, is I have had to spend a lot of time thinking about this. But that's also because I had thought a lot about, for some people, the outward focus of the church is, how do I get more people to the pulpit aspect of our church? And that's not what this is.
Yeah.
It's much larger than that. But even that word square, we don't use that a lot, but I think that's very helpful when you think of ancient cities that had a public square. That's where all kinds of various disciplines intersected. Mm-hmm. So I think it's a good image for us in that the square is where the church, the called out ones, the Lord's anointed ones, come into contact with those who are not yet part of that church.
Yeah.
So it's not really about a program. It's not even about a bunch of set of ministries as much as a direction that you look, because the inward focus has an attractive quality. The pulpit focus has an attractive quality, but it's not enough in and of itself. Like very few people are like, oh, those people seem to like each other, I want to join. Not everyone will do that. Or people are like, oh, I'd like something to believe. So that gathering looks like they know what they believe. Let me find that out. But you work with someone who goes like, what do you do with your time? What are you doing this weekend? You're like, this is what I'm doing with my weekend. Oh, why? And that's the part of the church that we're talking about, that we gather in some ways to look upward, to remind ourselves that there are people in our city, in the public square, so to speak, that are yet to be part of our church, but it's going to require us talking and thinking as though we exist to help them become part of the church.
Yeah. I like that right away as you kind of got to those existing relationships like your work, because I think a lot of people, when we talk about evangelism, they immediately think like open air preaching, or like Ray Comfort approaching people, or like giving out tracts and stuff like that. But like some of the best evangelism probably is going to happen from an existing relationship, because that's when you have a voice in someone's life. And I mean, it's funny because I've often been affirmed that I'm evangelistic, and people have been like, you have an evangelistic gift. But if I think about open air preaching or handing out tracts, I'm like, no way, not for me. But I've like at multiple jobs have gotten into hot water from talking too much about my faith. And I think almost the worst was there was one job where I then realized that I'd been so open about my faith that every time I was like unreasonably angry or did something bad, I was like, oh man, all these people now see me doing this as a Christian. But yeah, it's about just being with people, or to borrow from the book, which again, if you're joining us, missed the first two, or if you forgot, because this is going to be spread out and released. We stole this idea, the base idea, from a book, and in it, Joe Thorne, he breaks up this aspect into, he calls it participation, restoration, conversation, multiplication, which is a nice spin on, it's not alliteration, but they all end with ishin.
It's something shin.
Yeah, it's like, it rhymes, I guess. It's just a really boring rhyme. But yeah, participation is kind of what he identifies as step one. It's just actually being out there.
And some of like one of the things that I have spent a lot of time when people ask, like, what does it look like to be in the public square? What does it look like to be outward focused? I actually try to encourage, I was actually doing that today with someone I was conversing with, is why don't you start with where you're out at, how you're wired, what you're already doing, rather than thinking of adding something to your schedule or that, because that's always daunting. Like I'm missing a particular program, and so we got to start a program, and then I'll know if I'm doing evangelism. It's like, well, what sports do you like? Well, what do you like to read? What do you like to do for your hobbies? Where do you work? Where do you live? Are you active, mountain biker? Do you like to go to the mountains? What kind of people do you tend? Who are your friends? Those kind of things. Where do you shop? I mean, the things that you're already doing, and then how, as you are the church and as you go there to these things, how do you participate? Do you participate as someone who's just putting up with the world and just basically holding on for dear life to your salvation and can't wait to get to heaven, and as long as I can stay clean enough and make it through, then I can get to the end? It's actually a pretty white-knuckled Christianity. Whereas this is kind of an interesting aspect of being part of the church is that this means you get to go explore if you're much of an explorer. For me, that's like, I mean, when I was a kid, that's what I did. I pretended I was an explorer. And then I found out that pretty much every place was already conquered, and so it's like, oh, the exploring job is gone, so maybe I'll be a pastor then, or something like that. That's kind of hyperbole.
It's that Jim Carrey show, the non-comedy one, where he's like, the Truman Show. Oh yeah. Where he's like, I want to be an explorer, and the teacher pulls down the map and goes, well, honey, everything's already been found.
Yeah, and the thing is that everything in this world actually belongs to King Jesus, and some of it you don't know about. And so go find out what it's like. Take the gospel with you. You need to know the gospel inside and out. But once you know the gospel inside and out and are connected to community, so once you have the upward and inward, then it's actually safe to go out into connect with the world and not just be swallowed up by it. Yeah. Right? You can go to a movie with someone and have a conversation, but perhaps know, oh, this is what I saw, and I saw a picture of this, and have a conversation. So it's like you can use going to the movies as part of the public square in your life. You can do it as a group. You can use sports events. You can join a sports team. I love that Joe put participation because, again, what we've thought of the outward focus is how do we put on something inside of our pulpit service that people who don't know Jesus will come to.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's way harder work because the stuff we come up with is not always that cool. And hardly anyone comes and they're already familiar. And then we're like, oh, I guess we're bad at evangelism. No, it's like you're thinking all wrong. We're not supposed to do that. We're supposed to actually gather as Christians, as the church, remember the gospel, and then go out and explore and creatively do this in however many ways your church is able to do that.
Well, I think that's where it all ties together, because you're talking about watching a movie and making those connections. Well, if you're watching movies with other believers, then it's more likely that's where you get practice and you can have those discussions. You learn to make those connections so that you can get good enough at that to go out and do the same thing with someone that isn't a believer. But I also think that we often kind of get the order of operations wrong in evangelism. Like, my personal philosophy is that, like you're saying, what are you already doing? That is how I personally approach small groups. Is I think, okay, we all like disc golf. Let's go play disc golf and spend that whole time preaching, like speaking to one another's lives, talking about Jesus, confessing, like get to know each other and get vulnerable. And then that creates the relationships that then when we can sit down and go deep into theology and those sorts of things. But that also creates a space that then you meet someone who's into disc golf and isn't a believer, and you go, come join our disc golf group. And you're not inviting them to Bible study, you're just inviting them to disc golf, a lot more approachable. Then you invite them to the Bible study that you have after disc golf, and then you have then once they're in, that's when they go, wow, wouldn't it be great if we all got together all at once and sang songs? It's like, yeah, we actually do that. Like we try to get people to the finish line without going through kind of everything else. And
and I think I know Tim Keller has written kind of extensively on I think he lays out some 10 steps that someone will become a believer, but he says like the first 8 actually happen outside of the pulpit setting, like the relational side. And so we live in a city that works a lot. So I would encourage a lot of people, your work is going to be your primary spot. It's probably even it's top heavy to your neighborhood. Because you're probably at work more than you're in your neighborhood, at least accessible time in your neighborhood. And if you have a family, that's lower, right? Because you're with your family, and that's actually priority number 1. And so what we of the church has often done is we've trained people quite well to function inside of the square, inside of the pulpit, the worship service, and inside of a small group, and nothing toward the square. The problem is 80% of your time and your schedule is in the square, realistically, and rightfully so. You're not supposed to spend all of your time thinking about yourself. You're not supposed to spend all of your time in Christian community alone. So let's. I'm not saying let's even it out better, but I am saying perhaps we could spend more time in our pulpit service and our small or our table stuff, preparing for the square. That's what I would say.
When we actually both have spoken recently on Ephesians 4, which says that the purpose we're given, the pastors, prophets, evangelists, teachers, I don't remember all of them, it says to build us up for the work of ministry. Like that should be the goal. Is when I did my philosophy of youth ministry class, how was it you phrase it, way back in the olden days or something, in 2009. We talked about approaching youth ministry as you're trying to work yourself out of a job. Like you're always trying to say, okay, what kid's going to be a leader?
Yeah.
And then what leader could be a pastor? Then you're always training so that you theoretically could retire young or go hermit in a cave or whatever you want to do. But that is the model we're given for church, is that it's a time of worship, and it's a time of equipping us all to do the work of ministry, to all go into the square. It's not just for the quote unquote professionals.
Yes. And it, as you say that, I think this is where a lot of churches have really struggled, because this is by far the most intentional and the most uncomfortable part of living kind of the Christian life. Like, most of the time you won't get primarily hurt by Christians, although I have been, and it hurts bad. But it hurts because they're so close and you're connected to them. But the reality is you really do expect opposition from someone who doesn't think like you or believe what you do. And so it's not natural for us to go into uncomfortable situations.
Yeah.
It's just not instinctive. And we can't unless we believe it's actually an important part. But something that kind of came up, we watched a Shepherd video in Academy, and one of the things that occurred to me in that is that pastors, which is the word for shepherd, the shepherds in the video, they don't actually reproduce the sheep. The sheep reproduce the sheep. The shepherds make sure that the sheep are capable of reproducing, that they have healthy areas in which they can reproduce, and depending on when they give birth and whatnot, that they're well equipped for that work.
Yeah.
And so really, another reason why the church hasn't been good at the square part is because the square responsibility falls upon the shepherds, but it's actually not the shepherd's primary responsibility. Even as a church planter, a shepherd's primary responsibility is to equip all the church to be in community, to be in the pulpit, and to be in the square. And it's the tough part about that is that means you got to get out there.
Yeah. Well, and so to finish defining Joe's terms, because I did say them all. So we got participation, and then he says restoration. I think this is kind of the obvious one. Like we're like, we want to do something in the community. Let's go ladle some bowls of soup or hand out sandwiches. And it is a good thing. It is a way that we outpour what has been poured into us. It's a way that we show hospitality, that as we were strangers who were invited into God's family, we offer the same thing to people in the community by performing acts of love, acts of mercy, and offering restoration in this way. But then comes conversation, and that's kind of what you already mentioned, is that's where we're like, oh, I don't want to actually bring up the controversy.
Yeah.
Like, you think the words controversy and conversation have similar letters for a certain reason, but
I'll say something about kind of that conversation. I was talking with my friend Chris about this, and we were talking about, people thinking like missionaries, and it was like, I don't know how to be a missionary. I don't know what to say. But I said, that's actually because most people haven't spent enough time listening at the beginning. So when we say conversation and speaking truth into people's lives, what I might add to that is first listening to their life and their real issues, because part of the reason why our conversations fall dead is we spend a whole lot of time as a church developing answers to questions people aren't actually asking. And so when you listen to someone's story and you find out where they're at, then you actually know a little bit better as to how to apply the gospel. Well, how do you find out where someone's really at unless you spend time with them and ask them questions? How do you do that without participating? How do you do that without wanting to restore? You can't. But once you do, then it becomes somewhat easy. And I was thinking through a conversation like, how does the gospel go out of my neighborhood? And we rehearse the gospel regularly, but what we first had to do was listen to her complain about the school system, and then she brought something up, and then I was like, oh, okay, this is maybe what I would say. This is maybe where the gospel could enter into a conversation after 13 years of listening to this community that seems to be very opposed to the gospel. Is maybe after 13 years we now get asked. It's kind of like in a conversation like ours where at some point I realize I talk too much, and then I'm like, well, wait a second, Cody, what do you think? And then you get a chance to talk about whatever you want. I think that's what we need to do as Christians, is listen long enough to our city and our world and where all the brokenness is, to a point where our city actually finally goes, wow, we've talked an awful lot. What do you guys think we should do? Yeah. And that's actually where there will be real participation, restoration, conversation, and multiplication in our city. But we don't always know how long it takes, because I think the church has done a very poor job of listening. So what Joe is saying there are really 4 different ways that you listen in some ways to a community. Yeah. And it kind of comes full circle again, because even with our inward focus with discipling each other, if all we do is like sit down and rehearse, or like perform our rehearsed Bible study talk, we're not really listening to where people are at, and we don't know what they need to hear and how to speak into their lives. And that's where like actually just spending time with people. And I can think of lots of times when I was regularly preaching that I'd include something in my sermon from a not even remotely related to the Bible or anything else conversation. Or like I remember one time a young woman told me, she's like, well, I'm not gonna ask God to keep me from burning my eggs. And that stuck with me, that I always say, why not? Because if you ask God to keep you from burning your eggs, then when you don't burn your eggs, you have to thank him for it. But when you actually spend time with people, and like, I think you see a lot of really big pastors that kind of live their whole life in their tower, in their little study. And I think they lose out on a lot of the voice that they would have if they actually got out and spent time with the people. And one of my heroes, Tim Keller, had said once that when you start out, you need time with people and time in the Word, but actually this time with the people to know what's going on in their lives. And one of the things that he's known for is being able to connect. Like, people feel like you know what I'm thinking. Well, why do you think he does that? You think he comes up with this stuff because he's really, really smart? Well, he is. But he comes up with this because he has conversations with people and asks them questions, genuine questions. Why do you think that? And I think that's one of the big things I've learned, is rather than the kind of square interaction that our churches should be thinking, is rather than coming up with answers to people's questions, we should actually spend more time questioning people's answers. I think it's a more off-putting way to engage. So like you said, why not? I mean, the simple question is, why do you think that? And rather than, but the freeing thing of this is you don't have to have all the answers then. You don't have to spend the same kind of time preparing in the ivory tower all these specialized answers. If my daughter said, can you help me with my homework? And I was like, sure. Can I go back and spend 10 hours preparing? And then turns out, I prepared math and she wants me to help her with her art project. Well, and you're like, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you ask her, what is it that you need help with in your homework? But actually, that's what the church has done for years.
Yeah.
We hear, oh, they need help with their homework. We go back, we figure out, we guess what they want help with. We come back and it doesn't connect. And we're like, oh, well, let's go make a better project. And we still don't ask. And it's time the church just starts asking some questions. Why is this stuff in my city so popular?
But I immediately think of like a lot of, again, Reformed guys will punch at Reformed guys because they're our team. But I hear a lot of, we have to say sin is sin. You have to say sin is sin. It's like, yeah, but a lot of people aren't asking if their sin is sin. What they're asking is if they're redeemable, if they're lovable, if there's any hope for them.
Right.
But when we come out of the gate and we're just like, oh, just, your sin is sin. And it's like, that's not actually what they care to hear or need to hear or want to hear. Right. And it's true. And it doesn't need to be said. Yeah. But we're answering the wrong questions.
Yep. And it's maybe the wrong order.
Yeah.
And I think that's a great
you think of have you seen it's like an ongoing joke I see in videos all the time where someone will be like in a ditch or their car's upside down or something, and someone rolls by and they roll down their window and they go, hey, you can't park there. Yeah. It's like, that's true, but entirely unhelpful in this moment.
Yeah, that's a good image. Yeah.
Well,
could go on, but I'm sure we got to wrap this up.
Yeah, I guess the final point was multiplication. Okay. I feel like that's where that's where it leads, and I think if we come back to the second episode where I said like, how would a church look differently if everyone there is thinking of themselves as the church, as opposed to the church being an event, and then we talked about what are you robbing the church of? And I think naturally as a church becomes full and we all have this philosophy of what can I give to this church, and the church isn't this event, we are the church. I think that's where you're going to end up with some of the most organic new churches. Yeah.
And that is a good point. You're right to bring that up. And when you think about organic, like if you take the elements of what would grow a plant, which is kind of where you get that idea of organic. You say, well, I have sun, I have water, I have soil, and I have these seeds, and you kind of throw them in a pile, and you're like, this should go, right? No. Like, you need an order to this. Yeah. Organic doesn't mean there's chaos. It means that there are certain things you can do and certain things that you just have to depend on something else or someone else. But here's where multiplication enters into the picture, is that when a local church thinks it is the local church, it won't multiply. But if you put multiplication on the table in terms of the square, then you're suddenly freeing a lot of different people to reach a lot of different people. So that's how I would see that, as multiplication is really just, in some ways the ability, the freeing ability and opportunity to reach a particular type of people, because some churches can't. They don't have particular gifts because of time restraints, spiritual gift restraints, money restraints, geographic restraints. So it's like, well, plant another church, and no longer does that become a thing, because now it's a little more accessible for those people. So I think ultimately churches that do the first part, the first three, they participate. Whatever. Multiplication is the inevitable result of this. Yeah. Right? Like, you will have to multiply at some point, because the gospel is powerful. It's the power of God for salvation. So when the gospel goes out and connects in the public square from the church, this is what God uses to grow his kingdom. And it happens all the time, continually, always. And we just need more and more containers to capture that gospel growth. Yeah. So that's what multiplication is really just another container, because the gospel has grown that much more.
Yeah. I think that's the best note to end on, is that the gospel is powerful. The gospel is effective. And often when we think about doing church, here are my air quotes, audio listeners, right. We're like, what program do we need? We need to like entertain everyone the right way. We need to work out our discipleship funnel and get the pathway. But it's the gospel that changes hearts and lives. It's what Christ accomplished on the cross and the work of his Spirit and sanctification that at the end of the day is going to turn strangers to family. That's going to turn those who once were not a people to be part of this people. And it's not all on us to sing the right songs and dance the right jig and have the right Bible track to hand out, but it's that we are trusting that Christ builds his church and his gospel is true and powerful, and we're going to put that forward.
Amen. I agree.
All right. Well, this one went really long. I have a timer over there as looked at, but
so make sure you subscribe, like it. Don't just like theoretically like it, physically like it.
Yep.
And what else?
It's basically a follow on platforms.
Follow on
leave
the platform where you're at, and grow a beard.
Yes, it's true.
If you can.
Trevor has a little beard. It's good. It's a clean beard. It's a professional beard. Anyways, see you later.
See ya.